Hey everyone, I'm Farshad Abasi. I've been doing computer stuff for a long time. I think I got my first computer when I was 13, and that was mid-80s at some point, I don't remember. I started programming. I didn't have a lot of games for it, so I just started programming it, and I became really passionate about computers and writing software. And the next thing I knew, I ended up going to university, getting that degree thing, and then I ended up doing web development for a number of years. Sort of flip-flopped between development and IT, doing sysadmin, network admin, and also building software. My software experience is truly a full stack. I've written pieces that have modified Linux kernel, and I've written drivers to monitor processors. I've also written shopping carts and web applications and desktop applications. You name it, I've written it. And also on the IT side, I've managed IT environments for quite a few. I had 2 jobs where I managed networks that were mostly involved Mac computers at both of those jobs, and dealt with the challenges in the 90s. This is like the first one I was managing was in the mid to late 90s. It was all pre-OS X, and then the second one was thankfully during the OS X era. But sort of it's been an interesting journey. A lot of people focus on one or the other. They either build software or they're IT, sysadmin, network type people. And nowadays we have these DevOps people that are sort of the cross section between the two. And what I wanted to just sort of talk about was my journey through all this and how I've seen things change. The first few jobs that I had, not the web development ones that was just sort of all ad hoc and it was a small team of us writing web stuff. I worked at Motorola, very engineering oriented. They had the full stages of software development where they spent a lot of time doing requirements, and then they spent a whole bunch more time doing architecture, and then they would do all the design stuff for about a year, and then they would build it, and then and when I went from that small company where it was like 3 of us writing web applications and everyone was doing everything, I was the developer, I was the IT guy, I managed the Mac network, I did all the stuff, and I was used to installing my own database and writing the code and testing it and doing, setting up the web server and configuring all this stuff. And then I went to Motorola and they're like, oh, we're full on waterfall and you're writing code here. I'm like, what happens after I write the code? They're like, well, there's a whole other team that deploys it. I'm like, do I get to see how it's deployed? Do I get to install the database server? They're like, no. There's a whole ops team that does that. So that was really foreign to me, having come from that small shop where I got to do a bit of everything. And as time went by, I ended up working for other large firms. I worked at Intel, similar thing. I just worked on this piece of, this piece of the puzzle, and you never really saw what happens after. And to me, that was frustrating because I'd worked in a small environment where I did everything, and I really liked that. I really liked to be able to, know what happens after I build this thing and where it goes. And fast forward, ended up working at a startup during the .com, but we'll save that story for another time. Ended up about 10 years ago or 11 years ago, a friend of mine worked at HSBC, the bank, and he's like, hey, you're a software developer, you've been doing security. I've been teaching security since 2002, so about 17 years. But I never really did it as a full-time profession. It was like, I teach it, I know this stuff, I've done IT, I've done development. He's like, well, we need a person to come in and help our software developers build more secure software. And you're a software developer, security, that'd be a really good thing. And I'm like, that's interesting. Not a lot of companies. This was in 2008. We're kind of doing that kind of thing, right? So they hired me and they got a couple of other people to go and save these software developers and help them build secure software. And at the time, things were, waterfall oriented and there were iterations. So our team would, after the design was complete, we would do a design review, and then after they finished building it, we would test it. And oftentimes the teams are like, we've spent all this time and now you're coming and testing the stuff after it's been built. You're telling us we have all these problems. We got to go back and change requirements. That was a year and a half ago. Right? So that was not a very fun thing for anybody. So we started going, how can we integrate ourselves into the full software development lifecycle? How can we be there at all the different stages? Now with Waterfall, we figured, okay, if we're there during the requirements phase, then we can influence the requirements, right? And then when they go to do design, if we're there at that stage, we can influence the design. And when they're building it, if we're there with them, we can influence the build. So that was sort of like integrating ourselves within that Waterfall model. And it was interesting because this, like in 2009 or 2010, I was at a conference in Vegas, and the instructor put up his room, and he's like, how many people here have an application security team in the company? And these were all like massive companies. Only 2 of us put our hands up. So there weren't a lot of companies doing application security or incorporating it within the development lifecycle. And so I was like, that's cool, we're ahead of the game, and I'm learning a bunch of stuff. And then around the same time in 2010, 2011, we decided to do Agile. We're like, okay, you know what, this long cycles of development just isn't working very well. Let's do things iteratively. And they're like, well, how can we make security iterative? And they're like, okay, well, Farshad, you're our software security guy. Why don't you go and become a part of this full-time member of this sort of, we didn't call it DevOps at the time, it was like our agile teams, but why don't you go and become a full-time member? So I started attending, their daily stand-ups and all that kind of stuff, and it was like a waste of my time because, there was about only 10% or 20% of the time where there was something about security. So me going to these meetings every morning, it was like, well, let's step back and figure out if there's a better way to integrate security. So after fine-tuning things a bit, we figured, okay, you know what? I only need to go like once a week, look at the backlog, look at what they're putting into that iteration, tell them that these particular requirements may cause a problem or these user journeys, review the user stories they've kind of worked on, and then help them do some threat modeling iteratively. So about once a week was enough. I didn't need to be there full time. And then, so it ended up being where one consultant would help 3 different agile or DevOps teams at the time. And we also did the same thing with testing. We're like, well, you're not building enough for us to test every week or every sprint, but maybe every 3 sprints you have something good that we can come in and test. We're not going to leave it until product is built like we used to, but at least we're going to do it iteratively so that you'll know the list of issues as things go along. So then as things evolved, we're like, hey, maybe we should integrate automation into this whole, into this environment, right? Because the manual testing is still required because there are things that only the humans can do, right? When you're doing penetration testing, you need to figure out different threat scenarios, and then, those threat scenarios may require different steps. So those aren't things that a vulnerability scanner can just scan and tell you from the signatures, right? But the vulnerability scanning will determine about, a good chunk of your issues, maybe 80% or whatever that percentage may be. The low-hanging fruit often can be identified by using automation. So, then as we matured, we're like, okay, now we've got the people part down, we got the process part down, let's integrate some automation. So really, today, what DevSecOps teams should look like, it should be an integrated team with, you've got your developers, you've got your ops people, and then you integrate security as well. And the security component doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time person in there, but it's a combination of people, process, and technology, right? So what you do is you train the developers. So when they're coming up with their user stories, they come up with the evil story, right? So if they use the user story is like, well, the guy needs to click on this button to see his transaction summary for his accounts, but an evil attacker could, inject some input into that request and then see other people's transaction summary, right? So the training the developers, that's part of the process so that they do secure development as they're building things and thinking about the threat scenarios as they're coming up with designing the different components of their application, putting in some people, putting in a sec into the DevSecOps, right? So you need to go and get someone to do that, to do the manual assessment, to handhold the dev and the ops people's hands when they have questions. Now, your organization might be too small. You may not need to go and, it may not make sense for you to go hire someone full-time. In that case, what you could do is find who's in your team that really likes security, make them the security champion. Maybe entice them that, hey, 20% of your time, you go and spend it on security. We permit you to go and do that. And then they'll be able to train themselves and do most of it. Granted, it's a fairly big field, and they're not going to be able to learn everything about security, but at least they'll be able to answer the easier questions for the team, and then when they have questions, they can go to an SME if they need to. And then, of course, also putting in the technologies that help you with automation. So I've got a couple of slides just to sort of, I guess, wrap this up. This one, it just shows you how many defects are found through the different stages, right? So earlier, you can see 56% of the defects were because of issues due to requirements, about 27% due to design, and as you go further, it goes less and less. So it shows you the value of really shifting things to the left and dealing with them as early as possible. And in order to make things easier for the development teams, you can start with secure development and training. That's one of the first things we did at HSBC. I started doing lunch and learns. We had about hundreds of global teams that built software internally at the bank. So we were like, hey, you know what? It's lunch and learn time. You guys I'm going to come and do an hour-and-a-half presentation and just talk about security. Maybe if they're local teams, I'd bring them pizza and that sort of thing. And adopting the concept of people-centric security, right? Really getting the developers to be security-minded and empowering them to take personal responsibility for security. Oftentimes they're like, well, it doesn't matter. I'm working on this function, but it does matter because if the software breaks, the company loses money, everyone gets impacted, right? And really important, using frameworks and tools to handle security, right? I remember when we first started rolling out the program at HSBC, every team had written their own way of input validating or handling cross-site request forgery or some of these other things. We said, hey, why don't we have central tools built that are vetted by the security team, and then we just put these tools in the developers' hands, and then they can just leverage them, and they don't have to worry about security. That's not something they should be worrying about in terms of spending their time building. And then that also makes it more consistent when everybody is using the tools to do things the same way. And you can see here, you've got the dev, the sec, and the op teams coming together. So you really need to remove the barriers between the security and application teams, and the requirements should be clearly communicated. There have been so many times where if a requirement was handled differently, there'd be a lot of security issues would have been mitigated, but an analyst or someone making a business decision just didn't care and went ahead with that requirement, not knowing what the security implications could be, and then you'd go have to rip that out later, which is going to cost you a lot of money. And security review and testing should be done at multiple points in the DevOps workflows. Just to wrap this up, some tools, if you guys are wondering what can I put into my automation pipeline or build pipeline to automate security and catch some of the low-hanging fruit, there are usually 5 different aspects of concern. 3 of them fall under application security, so static code analysis. There are different tools. I put a few examples here. Find security bugs. It's really good for Java. You got Brakeman, Veracode, PumaScan for different environments. You should also do dependency checking, right? So the first one just looks at your code and says, hey, you know what? You've got a hash, and you're taking this hash, and if you're copying it into a string, you're just doing it using a loop. That's not a good way of doing it, because if you copy things byte by byte into a string array, you actually might end up with a collision in terms of a hash. So it'll catch those kinds of programmatic errors. But then dependency check tools, they'll look at what you're including in your app, right? You don't want to hinder the development, right? Like DevOps and Agile are all about going fast and getting the latest node package and putting it into your application, but that also comes at a cost because you're putting things from unknown sources, and if there's a vulnerability, you need to know about that, right? So by putting a dependency check tool and then running that on every pull request, it doesn't take a lot of time, but you always be informed whether there are vulnerabilities in your application as they're discovered. And then the last one here for application security would be dynamic scanning. So you can automate a bunch of malicious payloads and various things, just the same way that you would automate your unit tests, or you would come up with test cases that you run every once in a while automatically. You would do the same thing and build some security unit test cases and automate those using tools like Zap or Burp Pro. These tools have now got plugins for even API testing, so that you can feed your Swagger API definitions into them and have them do all kinds of wonderful things. And then also you should take care of environment scanning as well. So infrastructure scanning, there are tools like OpenVAS or Nessus. They're the one and the same. This is a fork of Nessus. This is open source. That's a commercial tool. And also doing a bit of SSL analysis to make sure that your application doesn't have any ciphers that are vulnerable. So if you put a package together with all these 5 things, you've taken care of most of the concerns, and you can integrate some of these, some of the quicker stuff on pull requests, and some of the things that take longer, like dynamic scanning. You can run them in a parallel build. So maybe maybe your application is out there for 4 hours when this thing is running. You might have a vulnerability, but you'll still know about it 4 hours later, and you're not stopping the deployment of the application, right? You're not causing blockage. So that's it. Hope I didn't go over time, but I think I had only 5 minutes, or I don't know if I did 10 minutes or 5 minutes, but if there are any questions, I'd like to hear them now.
Thank you, Farshad. That was the quick talk
I tried.
ever.
I'm good at fast talking.
Any questions? Chris, come on. I know you were analyzing that quick talk. Come on. Give us something good.
Are there industry certifications if you're, say, developing things and you're trying to look at your roadmap and go, well, if we hit security or industry certification X or Y, then we're covering a lot of things already?
Good question. Unfortunately, the industry is really new. As I said, even 10 years ago when I started doing this kind of thing, no one even heard of integrating security into their development program, but there are standards. So they're not certifications, but OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, a great organization. If you haven't heard of them, you should look them up. They actually have monthly meetups here in Vancouver, the great talks that you can attend for free. Just look up OWASP Vancouver. But they do have a standard. It's called Application Security Verification Standard. It's not just necessarily a verification standard. It's this bunch of security requirements that you can put into your set of requirements, right? Oftentimes when I worked on software, everything is a functional requirement, right? Security are non-functional requirements. No one cares about them. So you look at the list, they're like, oh, there's lots of functional requirements. Where's the non-functional? They might have backup and recovery and high availability, but security would be like, oh, one requirement. Well, make sure people can log in security, right? So what ASVS does is it actually has a good set of security requirements. Now, I think there's a couple of hundred of them. You don't need to put all 200 in every application. So what they do is they have levels. So level 1, level 2, level 3. So for level 1, you integrate like 50 or 60, and they tell you which ones they are. For level 2, it gets bigger, and then the full set would be a level 3. And they tell you when you should use level 1 or level 2 or level 3. Like for any application that's plugged into the internet, you should do a level 1. And level 2 is like things that have some personal information, smaller transactions, and then level 3 is large transactions, lots of data. So that can be used by the development teams to put that in their application. And then when a company like ours, like we do a lot of application assessments, so then we go and we use that standard to assess the application. So if people have built it to spec, when we come in to go do an audit, they'll probably have a better time at the end of it.
Thank you.